There was no villain in this plan, no madness, no rage, just paperwork. Entire cities were marked as acceptable losses. Millions of deaths were not feared. They were calculated. This wasn't a mistake. It was policy. There was nothing dramatic about the room where the decision was made. No shouting, no speeches, no raised voices arguing over morality. Just men seated at long tables, jackets off, sleeves rolled, pencils moving across paper. Maps were unfolded. Charts were stacked. Timelines were drawn with straight edges and careful hands. The language used was precise, professional, and deliberately bloodless. This was not a room where death was imagined. It was a room where death was accounted for. The plan did not begin with hatred. It began with arithmetic. Planners were given a problem: how to achieve objectives in a war that could not be won cleanly, quickly, or cheaply. The variables were known: enemy strength, terrain, industrial capacity, mobilization speed, civilian density, transportation nodes, weather patterns. And then, quietly, another variable entered the equation: human loss, not as a tragedy, not as a risk, but as cost. Millions were not predicted in the emotional sense. They were projected, estimated, allocated. Entire populations were reduced to figures that could be moved from one column to another. If an offensive shortened the war by 6 months but killed 2 million more civilians, that trade was evaluated, not questioned. In the margins of documents, phrases appeared that would never be spoken aloud outside secure rooms: acceptable losses, population degradation, collateral tolerance. These were not euphemisms meant to deceive. They were tools meant to function. The most disturbing part was not that these terms existed. It was how quickly they became normal. Once death was converted into data, discussion became easier, cleaner, more efficient. You could argue about percentages without ever picturing faces. And that was the point. The planners understood something essential. If death remained personal, the plan would fail before it began. Emotion would interfere. Doubt would slow timelines. Hesitation would fracture coordination. So the plan stripped humanity out of the process entirely. Cities were not cities. They were nodes. Neighborhoods were not homes. They were dense clusters. People were not people. They were demographic weight. A red circle on a map did not represent children, hospitals, or streets. It represented throughput, disruption. Pressure is applied to the enemy's system. The question was never, should this be done? The question was always, what is this by us? And once that framing was accepted, everything else followed. Casualty projections grew more precise over time. Early drafts used wide ranges, too uncertain, too emotional. Later versions narrowed the margins. Confidence increased. The numbers hardened. What began as a grim necessity became a benchmark. If a plan did not assume catastrophic loss, it was considered unrealistic. Optimism was treated as incompetence. Any officer who questioned projections was reminded that war itself was immoral, and that planning did not exist to make it kinder, only shorter. This logic was airtight. If war was inevitable, then minimizing its duration mattered more than minimizing its cost. If the survival of the state was at stake, then lives became a resource to be spent. If responsibility was shared across committees and departments, then no single person carried guilt. Everyone owned the plan, which meant no one owned the deaths. That diffusion of responsibility was not accidental. It was structural. Documents were signed collectively. Decisions were layered. Authority was fragmented just enough that accountability dissolved into procedure. Years later, many of the men involved would insist they never chose death. They only approved projections. They only validated assumptions. They only followed doctrine. And in a narrow technical sense, they were right. The horror of the plan was not that it demanded cruelty. It didn't. It demanded obedience. It demanded that intelligent, rational people accept that mass death was not a failure, but a prerequisite. That victory could be measured not by lives saved, but by timelines met. That millions die was not a catastrophe if it aligned with objectives. This was the moment the line was crossed. Not when weapons were built, not when orders were drafted, but when human life was removed from the equation and replaced with a number that could be justified. Once that happened, the rest of the plan wrote itself. And it did not need monsters to carry it out. Once the plan existed, it had to be made usable. That required translation, not into speeches or slogans, but into forms, procedures, and standardized language that could move through institutions without resistance. A plan that openly stated millions will die would stall. A plan that embedded that reality inside neutral processes would flow. So death was broken down. Civilian casualties became secondary effects. Urban destruction became infrastructure denial. Famine became a logistical outcome. Displacement became population movement. Every word was chosen carefully, not to lie, but to anesthetize. In briefing rooms, officers no longer spoke about bodies. They spoke about thresholds. How much disruption society could absorb before systems failed. How long do water treatment plants remain offline before disease spreads? How many hospitals could be removed from service before mortality curves spiked? None of this was hypothetical. It was modeled repeatedly. Past wars were mined for data. Bombing campaigns, sieges, blockades, epidemics. Each was stripped of context and fed into predictive frameworks. What mattered was not why people died, but how fast, in what numbers, and under which conditions. The models improved every year. At first, planners treated mass death as an unfortunate byproduct. Later, it became an instrument. Pressure applied to civilian populations was no longer something to be avoided. It was something to be calibrated. Too little suffering, and resistance hardened. Too much, too fast, and the infrastructure collapsed before it could be exploited. The optimal curve lies somewhere in between. That curve included children, not explicitly, not in writing, but inevitably. Demographics were layered into projections. Age distribution, birth rates, urban density by household size. Schools appeared on maps not as moral concerns, but as indicators of future strain on medical systems when services failed. No one said the word child. They didn't need to. The plan assumed that any population under pressure would lose its most vulnerable first. That was not cruelty, it was precedent. History supported it. Data confirmed it. And data was king. By the time the plan reached the implementation stage, the numbers were no longer shocking. They were familiar. Reviewed so often, they lost emotional weight. A projection of 5 million dead elicited no visible reaction. It sat beside fuel consumption charts and rail capacity tables. Same font, same spacing, equal importance. This normalization was the plan's greatest achievement. Once mass death became routine to discuss, resistance evaporated. Ethical objections sounded unsophisticated. Emotional distractions from real, strategic thinking. Anyone who raised concerns was reminded that failing to plan for death did not prevent it. It only made it uncontrolled. The plan promised control. Control over escalation. Control over timing. Control over outcomes. And most importantly, control over responsibility. Because if death was an emergent property of systems in motion, if it resulted from pressures applied rather than decisions made, then no one had to feel responsible. The plan did not kill anyone. It merely created conditions in which death occurred. That distinction mattered enormously. It allowed professionals to sleep at night. As the plan circulated upward, leaders approved it not because they desired destruction, but because rejecting it implied something worse. Uncertainty, delay, vulnerability. In an environment defined by fear, certainty was seductive, even when its price was measured in lives. Especially then, what no one said aloud, but everyone understood, was that once such a plan existed, it would shape future decisions, whether or not it was ever executed. It reset expectations. It established a baseline. Any alternative that promised fewer deaths, but less certainty, would now look irresponsible. The existence of the plan became its own justification. And the most chilling realization came last. The planners did not believe they were choosing death over life. They believed they were choosing inevitability over chaos. That belief allowed them to proceed without hatred, without rage, without remorse. The system did not require them to be evil, only precise, only disciplined, only willing to accept that some lives, millions of them, were already lost the moment the equation was solved. By the time anyone outside the room would feel the consequences, the plan would be unstoppable because it had already been accepted as reasonable. And once mass death becomes reasonable, nothing is unthinkable anymore. By the time the planners reached this stage, the war was no longer imagined as chaos. It was a system. Earlier assumptions had treated civilian deaths as an unfortunate byproduct. Tragic, regrettable, but external to the plan itself. That illusion did not survive contact with reality. As the models grew more detailed, the civilians stopped appearing as background noise. They became inputs, columns in spreadsheets, figures in tables, acceptable loss ranges. This was the moment when the plan crossed a line it could never uncross. In internal documents, language shifted subtly. Population centers replaced cities. Industrial density replaced neighborhoods. Human cost became attrition. Each abstraction peeled away more resistance, making it easier to move forward without stopping to ask what forward meant. The planners knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that modern war could not be confined to armies. Factories fed fronts. Power grids sustained production. Transportation networks tied everything together. To break the enemy's ability to fight, the system itself had to be attacked. And systems included people, not as individuals, as mass. One document outlined projected fatalities not as a warning, but as a confirmation of effectiveness. High numbers meant the plan was working. Lower numbers suggested insufficient pressure. Death was no longer a failure state. It was feedback. This was not sadism. That distinction matters. The men writing these plans were not monsters in the way history prefers. They were methodical, educated, often uncomfortable, but committed. They believed that by calculating the unthinkable, they were preventing something worse. That belief insulated them from what they were authorizing. Because once death is treated as a variable, it becomes manageable. One planner wrote privately that the true challenge was not killing millions, but deciding which millions mattered less in strategic terms. Urban workers were replaceable. Rural populations were logistically irrelevant. The elderly and children consumed resources without producing war value. None of this was written in those words, but it was encoded in targeting priorities. The coldest sections dealt with escalation. What happens after the first wave? What happens when retaliation comes? What happens when populations panic, migrate, and starve? The answers were not, we stop. They were, we adjust. Fallback scenarios were in place for famine, refugee collapse, and disease outbreaks. Each one included revised casualty projections, not to mitigate them, but to account for them. The plan assumed society would break in stages, not all at once. That collapse was not feared. It was anticipated. At no point did the plan assume public consent. This war would not be voted on. It would not be explained. The scale alone would paralyze comprehension. Leaders assumed that once events began, populations would be too shocked, too frightened, too disoriented to resist policy decisions already set in motion. Fear was not a risk. It was leverage. What's most unsettling is how rational it all appeared on paper. Every assumption had precedent. Every fear had historical grounding. Firebombing campaigns, blockades, siege warfare, genocide, famine, all of it had happened before. The planners were not inventing horror. They were systematizing it. And once systematized, it became harder to argue against. Anyone who raised objections was not dismissed as immoral, but as unrealistic. Idealism was framed as irresponsibility. To refuse to plan for mass death was, in this logic, to invite uncontrolled death later. So the planners kept going. They refined estimates. They tightened timelines. They rehearsed outcomes. Somewhere along the way, the plan stopped being about winning a war and became about managing annihilation in a way that preserved power structures afterward. Survival of the state mattered more than survival of its people, because the state was assumed to be the only thing capable of rebuilding. That assumption justified everything. This is where the true horror lives. Not in explosions that never came, but in the quiet consensus that formed behind closed doors. A shared understanding that millions would die, and that this was acceptable if the alternative was losing control. The plan was never executed, but it was complete. And completion is its own kind of violence. The most dangerous part of the plan was not the weapons. It was quiet. No crowds. No protests. No emergency debates. The war plan advanced in rooms where voices were low and doors were closed. Silence wasn't accidental. It was engineered. Secrecy was framed as a necessity. The logic was airtight. Public knowledge would cause panic. Panic would weaken resolve. Weaken resolve would invite attack. Therefore, the public could not be trusted with the truth. Democracy, in this moment, was treated as a liability. So the plan lived in classified annexes and restricted briefings. It was spoken in euphemisms and acronyms that stripped away emotional weight. Words like catastrophic were avoided. Words like irreversible were replaced with high impact. The language was designed not to lie, but to anesthetize. Even within government, access was fragmented. No one saw the whole picture. A transportation official saw rail disruptions. An energy planner saw grid failures. A defense analyst saw strike efficiency. Only a handful of people saw the cumulative result, and even they rarely spoke of it in full. Compartmentalization didn't just protect secrets. It protected consciences. If no one feels responsible for the entire outcome, guilt dissolves. That silence extended upward as well. Civilian leadership was brief in stages, often with optimistic framing. Worst-case casualty numbers were presented alongside phrases like unlikely or conditional. Confidence was emphasized. Doubt was minimized. By the time leaders realized the true scale, the plan had already been normalized through repetition. Psychologists later identified this pattern. Moral drift. Not a single decision feels monstrous on its own, but taken together, they form something indefensible. Inside the planning culture, dissent did exist, but it was procedural, not ethical. Arguments focused on feasibility, timing, and redundancy. Rarely did anyone ask the forbidden question. Should this be done at all? That question had no place in the system. To ask it would imply that the enemy might deserve survival. Or worse, that restraint was an option. In a zero-sum worldview shaped by total war, restraint looked like surrender. And so silence became loyalty. Those who stayed quiet were promoted. Those who raised concerns were sidelined, not punished, just excluded. Their absence from key meetings ensured the plan moved faster. Bureaucracy has a way of selecting for compliance without ever issuing an order. The public, meanwhile, lived in a parallel reality. Speeches spoke of peace through strength. Budgets were justified as deterrence. Exercises were framed as routine readiness. Nothing about the plan required lying to the public, only not telling them everything at once. The truth was fragmented into pieces too small to provoke outrage. No single disclosure sounded apocalyptic. Together, they were annihilation. The media played its role without coordination. Complexity discouraged scrutiny. Technical jargon bored audiences. Editors avoided stories that couldn't be easily explained. Over time, the absence of clear alarms created the illusion that nothing was wrong. Silence does not need a conspiracy. It only needs inertia. What's chilling is how ordinary it all was. No dramatic confrontations. No evil speeches. No villain monologues. Just meetings, memos, revisions, coffee breaks. The plan matured not because people wanted mass death, but because no one found a moment between stopping felt justified. Each delay seemed dangerous. Each question felt like hesitation. And hesitation, in this system, was treated as weakness. By the time the plan was finished, it no longer felt optional. It felt inevitable. That is how systems commit atrocities without ever announcing them. Not through rage, but through momentum. Not through hatred, but through professional duty. The silence didn't hide the plan. It enabled it. And once silence becomes a foundation of decision-making, the outcome no longer shocks the people inside the system. Only those outside, if they ever learn the truth at all. The plan justified itself with a single word, deterrence. It was repeated so often that it lost meaning. Deterrence became a spell, spoken to ward off doubt. If the plan existed, war would never happen. If the weapons were ready, they would never be used. If the numbers were horrifying enough, no rational enemy would dare cross the line. That was a theory. But deterrence depended on something fragile, shared rationality. It assumed the enemy would think the same way, calculate risk the same way, and value human life the same way. It assumed clarity in moments where history had shown only confusion. The planners knew this. Internal studies acknowledged the risk of misinterpretation, false alarms, and accidental escalation. Communication lines could fail. Radar could glitch. Commanders under pressure could make irreversible decisions in minutes. And yet the plan expanded. Instead of asking whether deterrence was stable, the system responded by making retaliation faster, broader, and more automatic. Human judgment was treated as a bottleneck. Machines were introduced to compress decision time. Redundancy was added not to prevent launch, but to ensure it could never be stopped. The logic was circular. Because war would be catastrophic, deterrence had to be absolute. Because deterrence had to be absolute, catastrophe had to be guaranteed. At a certain point, the plan no longer existed to prevent war. It existed to ensure credibility. The threat had to be believable. And believability required willingness. That willingness was never publicly admitted, but it was embedded everywhere. In launch exercises, in targeting priorities, in casualty acceptance thresholds. The system was calibrated not around survival, but around resolve. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Deterrence only works if mass death is not just possible, but acceptable. If leaders were unwilling to cross that line, the threat would collapse. The plan assumed they would choose annihilation over humiliation. That assumption was never proven. It was simply inherited. Each generation of planners accepted it as settled doctrine. To question it was to undermine the entire strategic framework. And frameworks, once built, defend themselves. Careers, budgets, alliances, all depended on deterrence remaining unquestioned. So the evidence was reframed. Near misses were called successes. Accidents were labeled as learning experiences. Escalation crises that narrowly avoided disaster were cited as proof that the system worked. Survival was mistaken for validation. But survival does not mean safety. It can also mean luck. By the late stages of the Cold War, some analysts began to notice the contradiction. The more complex deterrence became, the more fragile it was. The faster the response times, the less room there was for correction. The more weapons were deployed, the harder it became to control escalation. In theory, deterrence stabilized the world. In practice, it balanced it on a knife's edge. What made this delusion durable was distance. The people designing deterrence would never experience its consequences firsthand. The deaths were abstract. The cities were coordinates. The casualties were variables in equations. When millions are reduced in numbers, morality becomes optional. And so deterrence was treated not as a gamble, but as a law of nature, as if the universe itself demanded these preparations, as if the system had no alternatives. But there were alternatives. Arms reduction, de-escalation frameworks, slower decision chains, shared verification systems. None was perfect, but perfection was never the goal. Survival was. Yet those paths required trust. And trust was seen as weakness. In a worldview shaped by existential fear, cooperation looked naive. Preparing for the worst felt safer than imagining the best. So the plan remained. Not because everyone believed in it, but because no one believed they could escape it. Deterrence became less a strategy than a psychological cage. Leaders told themselves the weapons would never be used, even as they ensured they could be launched at any second. That contradiction was never resolved. It was simply endured. The Cold War ended quietly. No final warning sirens. No launch orders. No cities erased in white light. The enemy vanished. But the plan did not. It remained intact and operational, long after the ideology was built to counter collapsed. War plans designed for a bipolar world suddenly existed in a fragmented one. Targets dissolved into new borders. Alliances shifted. Assumptions expired. But the machinery stayed ready. That was the final irony. The system created to prevent annihilation proved incapable of standing down once annihilation was no longer imminent. Missiles stayed fueled. Launch crews stayed trained. Command bunkers stayed manned. Because no one could prove the world was truly safe. Strategic planners faced an uncomfortable question. If deterrence had worked, how could it be dismantled without risking failure? The very absence of catastrophe was used to justify preserving the tools that could cause it. Success became indistinguishable from dependency. The plan had outlived its purpose, but not its logic. New threats were retrofitted into old frameworks. Regional conflicts were mapped onto global retaliation systems. Rogue states, non-state actors, uncertainty itself. Everything became justification to keep the structure alive. The original enemy was gone. The fear remained. And fear, once institutionalized, does not retire. The most revealing shift was psychological. During the Cold War, annihilation was framed as a consequence of war. Afterward, it became a background condition of peace. Something managed, something normalized, something no longer discussed openly, but never dismantled. The unthinkable became routine. War plans were updated by committees that had never lived under air raid drills. Launch authority passed the leaders born after the doctrine was written. The memory of why the system was terrifying faded, while the system itself remained. That is how danger becomes invisible. The greatest casualty of the plan was imagination. Over the decades, military thinking narrowed. Alternatives were treated as unrealistic. Any security model not backed by overwhelming force was dismissed as idealism. The idea that survival might depend on restraint rather than readiness felt radical. So the future was shaped by the past. Even as technology advanced, doctrine lagged behind. Faster sensors, faster networks, faster weapons, all layered onto assumptions built in an era of slower communication and centralized control. Speed replaced judgment. Automation replaced deliberation. The plan became more efficient, but less human, and that raised a final unsettling truth. The system no longer required belief. It did not need ideological rivalry or moral conviction. It only needed momentum, budgets, maintenance cycles, training schedules. In that sense, the plan became autonomous. It did not wait for enemies. It generated them. Every new weapon justified a counter. Every counter justified escalation. Not because anyone wanted war, but because the structure demanded continuity. The Cold War did not end with victory parade. It ended with a quiet inheritance. A world handed a set of tools capable of ending itself, along with instructions written for a conflict that no longer existed. And still, no one dared discard them, because doing so would require faith. Faith that the future would not repeat the past. Faith that rivals would choose restraint. Faith that humanity could step back from the edge without falling. Faith is risky. Deterrence feels safer. So the plan remains, not as a choice, but as a habit. Not as a strategy, but as inertia, a relic powerful enough to shape decisions decades after its rationale expired. That is how doctrines truly die, or fail to, not in defeat, not in triumph, but in quiet persistence. The war plan that assumed millions would die was never executed, but it was never buried either. And as long as it exists, the possibility that it was built for still exists with it, not as destiny, but as an option.